Hi, everybody. Hello, welcome. We're going to let everybody populate for a minute here. Welcome to the Disability Voices United and Disability Rights California webinar series on our communication series. I'm going to give people just a second here. Okay. Well, I'm Darlene Hansen, and I'm from Disability Voices United. And I want to welcome you to our day one of our training series. Before I get started with the whole training today, I want to introduce Lorna Silva, and she is one of our Spanish speaking interpreters. And I want you to explain how English-Spanish works to us, Lorna.
Okay. So I'm going to make the announcement in both languages. Voy a hacer un anuncio rápido en los dos idiomas. So we are using the Zoom interpreting feature. If you're on your computer, you're going to see it at the bottom. You should see a globe, then that's the interpretation feature. If you speak English, please select English. You do not need to select mute original audio. It is important that you pick a channel, that you pick English so that you can hear interpretation into English in case there are questions in Spanish. If you are on a mobile device, you will find the interpretation feature on the three little dots that say more, and then you would do the same to pick a channel, to choose interpretation and then a channel. Para las personas que hablan español, estamos usando la función de interpretación de Zoom. Si usted está en su computadora, la va a encontrar en la parte de abajo de su pantalla, va a ver el mundito y de ahí selecciona usted el canal de español. Si no quiere oír el inglés, seleccione silenciar el audio original, si no, déjelo como está. Y si usted está en su teléfono móvil o en una tableta, va a encontrar la opción de interpretación en los tres puntitos al lado de su pantalla que dicen más. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorna. Okay, so everybody choose their level. All right, give a minute to do that. All right. Well, good evening, good afternoon. I'm Darlene Hansen, as I mentioned, and together with Nina Spiegelman and Beas Vascolostes, if I said that right, William Del Rosario, and Ed Herzl, we make up the Disability Voices United branch of the Communication Disability Access Network grant, which is what's bringing this to you all. This series was built to train and activate a network of Californians with disabilities to gain access to communication supports and to our communities. What we have been finding in our surveys and such that hopefully you all got to participate in is that access to communication is one of the top issues, and acknowledgement of communication needs. That was a biggie too as well. So hopefully this will be day one of starting to tackle these situations. We're happy to partner with Disability Rights California and grateful to Ability Central for this opportunity to host the three-part series, World of Possibilities, on communication access and rights. Just as a reminder, if you're here today, you obviously registered for the event. It's a three-part series, and you will use the same link next week and the following week. As a reminder though, Ed will be sending out the information the day before, the day of the next Tuesday, okay? So you'll have reminders, but if you wanted to, you could just save this same link and it'll get you right back in again. We're also recording these sessions. So the recordings will be posted and archived on Disability Voices United website and YouTube channel, I believe. So if you have people that you know that should have been here and weren't able to make it today, feel free to share that information and share information about the next 2 weeks as well. So hopefully more and more people can get involved. We had a great response to this, so we're hoping it gets the word out to a lot of people. We're so excited we want to have all of you involved in the sessions. And we've made these sessions an hour and a half long specifically because we want you, especially AAC users, to get involved if you choose to. But there's plenty of time for the questions and answers. So please let your voices be heard here. So now I want to turn it over to Ray Kwong of Disability Rights California. Ray.
Hello, thank you, Darlene. Thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon. Just a quick overview on Disability Rights California. We are a statewide nonprofit agency, and we provide free legal services to people with disabilities with disability related issues. So today's topic is on communication. If you have trouble getting communication, you're more than welcome to give us a call. I will put our website and our phone number in the chat. Feel free to visit our website and review the wealth of publications we have. I'm going to pass it to the next presenter.
Okay, that's hi. So this is Nina Spiegelman from Disability Voices United, also affectionately known as DVU. And we are a statewide advocacy organization directed by and for people with disabilities and their families. We advocate for choice and control, meaningful outcomes, and equity and accountability from the systems that serve us. We have always included in our mission advocating for the right to access communication supports. And thanks to this grant from Ability Central, we are thrilled to be partnering with DRC on this training series on leadership skills for self-advocates. And now I guess we'll turn it over to Matt Cherry from Ability Central.
Thank you. Thanks for the welcome. I'm delighted to be here. This is honestly my first meeting in my new role as Director of Philanthropy at Ability Central. And I just want to give you a very brief, I promise it will be brief, introduction to the work of Ability Central. Ability Central works to ensure that more people get to exercise their basic right to communicate. And we do that in a couple of ways. Since 2010, Ability Central, formerly known as the Disability Communications Fund, has granted about $1 million a year to organizations in California that help people with communication challenges. We are delighted that we've been able to support the work of DVU and DRC through this funding program. We also provide those organizations with practical help, including convening meetings and trainings. And Ability Central is now working to expand its services, including expanding resources for individuals looking for help with communications. A lot of those resources will be launched later this year, but you can get a partial sneak peek at our new website, aboutus.abilitycentral.org. And it will give you a little teaser for what's coming. And I'm just like to say I'm delighted to be here to learn more about the great work you're all doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. So nice to meet you. Okay, let's get started with our presentation. So I'm going to turn this over to Megan from Disability Rights California, and she's going to get us going.
All right. Thank you, everyone. My name is Megan Lizette. I am a supervising attorney at Disability Rights California, and I'm going to be doing a lot of talking today, but there will also be opportunities for all of you to weigh in and share your ideas. So I look forward to hearing from all of you as well. Before we go too much farther, I want to make sure that people who need a visual to follow along with have a copy of the slides. So we have it in a little bit different format for you. So Raymond is going to drop into the chat two different documents. One is the Spanish version and one is the English version. So all of the words on the slides are just what you see on the screen. So don't try to follow along if it just makes your life harder, but if you need something visual, particularly for the Spanish speakers who'd like to be looking at the Spanish version, but also hold on to that document as your kind of free souvenir from this training series. It has some links in it. So anywhere where you see a little blue link in the words of the PowerPoint is something you can click and pull up one of Disability Rights California's publications that goes into greater depth about the things we're going to talk about. So don't try to read those while we're on this training, but save those as a little goodie for later. All right. Okay, so I expect and hope that folks will have questions as we go along, because that means you're listening and learning, which is good. So if you have questions and you're able to type them in the chat, please feel free to do that right when you think of it. If it takes you a while and by the time you're done typing it, we've moved on to another topic, don't worry about it. We'll come back to it. We still want to get them in the chat so we can be sure that by the end of the day, we come back to all of your questions. If typing doesn't work for you, feel free to raise your hand. And then when we have a good moment to pause for questions, someone will call on you and unmute you so that you can speak your question.
Megan, real
Yeah,
quick.
sure.
And by raise your hand, we mean raise your virtual hand
Yes.
in Zoom, okay? Because we can't see everybody on the same screen. So
And it's awkward to be doing this, right?
yeah. So in reactions at the on your menu bar there, in reactions, there is an opportunity to raise your hand. So that's what we mean when we say raise your hand.
Thank you for clarifying, Darlene. I appreciate it. All right, so those are all the ways to ask us a question that's about what you see on the slides, and that's sort of general questions that the answer to it would help other people who are on this training. If you have a really specific question about your own situation that you would have to share details about your life to ask the question, that's a good sign that what you might want to do instead is sign up to do an intake with Disability Rights California, where we can talk with you confidentially and give you specific advice about your specific situation. So if you want to sign up to get a call back to do an intake about your legal problem, you can see on this slide there is a link, and Raymond is also going to drop it in the chat. So you don't need to click that link if you don't have a legal problem, but if you do, that's a good way to sign up, and we will get back to you. Normally, when Raymond and I do a training like this, we make promises about how soon we'll get back to you. We say, oh, within 2 days or within 3 days. I will be honest with you, this is a big group, which is awesome. I'm glad there are so many people here, but if we get a lot of responses, it might take us a little bit longer. So my hope is that if you sign up, we'll get back to you before we meet again next week. But if you have something more urgent, it's always fastest to just call us at our 800 number if you have an urgent legal question. So, but if it's not super, super urgent, you can fill out the form and we'll get back to you probably within a few days. All right, so I just want to start with a little roadmap to the whole 3 days. You kind of know where we're going. You don't have to memorize any of this, just want folks to feel oriented. So our goal over the next 3 sessions is to learn what communication supports are, who can get them, our rights to communication supports in different areas of life, how to ask for them, how to figure out who should pay or who should provide the communication support, especially when there's more than one choice, more than one agency that maybe should. What you can do if somebody says no. And then we save the best for last. So day 3 is going to be all about hearing from some self-advocates who've been there and are going to share their real life experiences with trying to get communication supports. And I think that's really going to bring it all to life to see what it looks like in real people's real lives. So I'm looking forward to day 3. All right, so today we're first going to go over some general information and general principles to get us started before we launch into the details of your rights in specific situations. So we'll talk about, kind of general concepts about how to ask for things, how to figure out who should be giving you the communication support so you can ask at the right place, those kind of good things. And then we will shift into talking about some particular settings or situations where you might need communication supports. So we'll talk about your rights in settings like school, college, in dealing with the Department of Rehabilitation, and at work. So don't hold me to this. Again, our priority is answering your questions. So if we run out of time, we've got to bump some of this to next week, we will. Don't panic. It doesn't mean you missed anything. We'll make sure we get to it. But this is the tentative plan. All right. And then assuming all goes as planned, on day 2, we'll have a little bit of a refresher from today. And then we'll continue talking about communication supports in different settings. And then we'll talk about a sort of different scenario where there are communication supports you need purchased once and then you use them everywhere. So there are some different agencies you might be dealing with in those situations. So that'll be on day 2. And then time allowing on day 2, we'll talk about some practice situations, some examples of people's communication needs and what they might be able to do to help kind of make sure that we learned what we were supposed to have learned over the first 2 days. And then again, day 3 is the best part. We'll get to hear from William, Veas, and Ed, all of whom are on this call today, and hear about their successes, their challenges, what they've learned along the way in getting communication supports for themselves. All right. So let me just pause there. Do we have any questions in the chat so far that we should stop and answer right now?
At the moment, I don't see anything in the chat.
All right, and I see someone raising their real
Oh.
hand if somebody wants to unmute Henny so that Henny can speak and ask a question real quick.
Hello, thank you for just want to add information and remind people that if you are in self-determination with regional center, the communication support person does not have to be licensed or a speech therapist, because we are trying to move away from the traditional model. So do not limit yourself and find people who are supportive to your communication and your needs, even though they don't have a license. So definitely keep looking and expanding your network to find people who are helpful to you so that they can be a covered cost in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Henny. That's a great preview of day 2, because we'll talk a little bit about Regional Center on day 2. So preview of coming attractions, I love it. All right, so before I start throwing information at you, I would like some information from all of you, if you're willing. So we have a little poll where you can tell us what agencies you get services from, or if you're here on behalf of another person, if you're a parent or a service provider, tell us who that person gets services for, so we can kind of, so everybody can kind of see, you know, who has similar situations. So I think Ed is going to launch the poll for us here.
Just 1 second. I apologize, folks. We're having a little bit of some technical issues.
No worries, no worries. We can hang out while you get it sorted out, Ed. So the way the poll is formatted, you don't have to choose just one. You can check all of the ones that apply to you. And if there's one that you used to get services from, but not anymore, you can skip over that one. We just want to know kind of what agencies you're dealing with currently.
I apologize, folks, because DVU is a small organization. Myself and my executive, or excuse me, my president and acting executive director, Judy, share. We share a Zoom account, and basically what that means is because she logged in earlier, it's not letting me launch the poll. So I have to apologize. We know this for next time.
No worries. Thanks, Ed. So life, especially in 2021, is all about adapting as we go, right? So if people want to put in the chat what agencies you're a client of, I know we won't get as clear of information, but it will give you a chance to see kind of who else is here and what their situations are. So I will list the agencies and then I'll repeat them. So a school district, if you are getting services from a school district. If you're getting a services from a college or university. If you are a client of a regional center. If you're a client of Medi-Cal. And if you're a client of private health insurance. Did I catch them all, folks? My DVU and DRC peeps, let me know if I missed any. So I'll repeat that. A school district, a college or university. Oh, Department of Rehabilitation.
Yep.
That's the one I forgot. Department of Rehabilitation, DOR.
Lots of people are regional center persons
Great.
and other things, those schools and medical,
And then Medi-Cal, private health insurance.
private, some people have private insurance.
There's
Shout out to the regional center folks. I started my career at DRC as a client's rights advocate. So that's the department of our agency that specifically serves regional center clients. And it's still where my heart is. So I'm really glad that there are lots of regional center folks here. That's awesome.
We have some college people too, so that's good to know.
Yay, we love that.
a few DOR.
Awesome. Great. So we've got a good mix. I love it. Sounds like we're not seeing a lot of school district. Is that what I'm hearing?
A few
There's some school,
districts
yes.
have-
There's some
Great.
school.
Yeah,
Okay, great. This also helps me know where to kind of focus our time. I don't want to spend too much time on things that people don't need to hear about. So it's good to know
it's
that we're
pretty much the whole
got
umbrella.
folks from dealing with every agency.
I
Great.
think we do.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for dealing with our on the fly modified version of the poll. I love it.
Old
I
school.
appreciate your flexibility. Old school as much as typing in the chat on Zoom can be old school, right?
Yeah, I know.
It's all relative. All right, well, keep typing your answers if you're still in the middle of it. You don't have to stop, but I'm going to keep going so we can keep things moving along. So I want to talk a little bit about magic words before we dive in. So I'm a big believer that when an attorney like me does a presentation to normal people who are not attorneys, if my presentation, if the heading on every slide is the name of a law, I have failed to do my job. I don't think that we need a lot of legal jargon in order to know our rights and enforce our rights. I think it's much more important to understand the actual concepts that are in the law, which actually usually are much simpler than it makes it seem, right? When we throw a bunch of big words at you, it can be intimidating and confusing, and it makes it harder than it needs to be. So I'm going to do my best, despite being hindered by the fact that I'm an attorney, to use regular real people words today. But when I am going to throw some legal terms at you, I'm going to warn you by calling them magic words. And this little slide, and for those who need a visual description, it's a picture of a top hat with a rabbit's ears coming out of it, like a magician is about to pull the rabbit out of the hat, and a magic wand with little stars coming off of it. And I think it's appropriate because most of the time it really works to ask for things in your own words, but once in a while it's helpful to be able to pull the magic words out of our hat. So we're going to bring up magic words when we need to, but most of this presentation we're going to talk about things in normal language. And for those so I've deliberately left legal citations out of this presentation because I think it's just distracting. So if you're wanting to know the name of a law that gives you the right that we're talking about, for the most part, we're not going to talk about that today. But in the handout version of this presentation, if you click on the little blue links on a slide that you want to know more about, it'll pull up publications that most likely do have more details about what laws apply, what they're called, details about deadlines to do things, all that good stuff. So if you're dying for more, that's where you can find it. All right. So I'm going to want to hear from you all again. So what are communication supports? And I think the people on this call are probably the experts, much more so than I am. So if you can think of one, type in the chat an example of something that could be a communication support, either one you use or one you think somebody else might use. And Raymond, if you don't mind unmuting and reading some of those out as they come in so everybody can hear everyone else's good ideas, that would be great.
Sure. Auto transcription software. That was the first one. Email, phone.
And for our self-advocates who are going to be presenting on day 3, if you want to throw one in the chat to get the ball rolling, that's great too.
Picture, PRC. Whoop, I missed one. Assistance with Oh, the chat keeps scrolling. Excuse me. Assistance with initiating, maintaining, and terminating communication. Additionally, de-escalating conversation that did not go as planned. TTY, email, regulations communication partner, type/points to letters. Parents are my interpreters to explain in simple terms. Effective communication device, support for communication to be effective. Many times we're ignored or silenced because of how we communicate. Talking calculator, another email and phone, braille note taker, audiobooks, deaf interpreter, transliterator, I think that's how you pronounce it, visual support, narratives, scripts, modeling, time and patience so people can process what they're trying to say. This one says not to be confused with AS interpreter, also a communication support. And the last one I see here is text to speech.
Awesome. So I'm loving the variety of things, right? And I'm seeing some themes, right? Some of these supports are high tech, some are low tech, some are expensive, some are cheap, some are totally free and already available to all of us, right? And communication supports can be things, right? Devices, technology, or people, right? Some of the great examples in the chat were support ways that people provide you support to help you communicate better. So a communication support can be almost anything you can imagine, right? I think we probably on this call have some people who are really creative about finding ways to communicate and figuring out what helps. So a communication support is pretty much anything a person with a disability needs to communicate, to either make themselves understood or to understand others. And you all have illustrated that really well with your great variety of examples. Thank you so much for that. So now that we know what can be a communication support, who can get a communication support? So the bottom line, and a theme you'll see as we talk about specific situations, is that to be entitled to communication supports in most situations, you need to have a disability that affects your ability to communicate, to understand or be understood, and therefore you need a communication support, right? That's pretty intuitive. And in different situations, there will be different magic words for that, but they all kind of come back to that theme. And once you figure out what the magic words actually mean, because sometimes they're unnecessarily complicated, right? That's basically what they get at, right? You have a disability, therefore you need a communication support. That's what makes you entitled to it in different situations. All right, so let's talk about some kind of basic concepts in asking for what we need. So an important first step is to figure out who to ask. And I know that sounds kind of obvious, but the reason I bring this up, is that in our work at DRC, we talk to a lot of people who are really frustrated for a lot of different reasons. And there are a fair number of those people who the reason they're frustrated is that they're trying really, really hard to advocate for something. And it might turn out they've been asking the wrong person or the wrong place. And that's why they're getting blank stares or kind of confused answers, because they asked the right question, but they asked it of the wrong place. And it's not the end of the world. It's not unfixable, but it takes a lot of energy, right? Advocating for yourself is a lot of work, and we all only have so many hours in the day. So taking that minute to make sure that you're asking the right entity and asking the right person at that entity can save you a lot of grief in the long run. And we'll talk a little bit more as we go along about how you figure out who that is. I also always encourage people, when you can, to make your request in writing. Now, sometimes that won't be possible or practical, and that's okay. But when you can, you want to ask in writing. Can anybody think of a reason that might be? You can either type your reason in the chat or use the button to raise your hand, and we'll have somebody unmute you.
So
And
just reading from the chat, written record of interaction creates a paper trail. Paper trail,
Excellent.
documented evidence of your request, record keeping.
Yes, very good. You guys get it. This does not surprise me at all.
We also
It's,
have someone who, sorry, raised
oh,
their
that's
hand here.
okay. Great. Do you want to unmute them, or can somebody unmute them? I can't see the raised hand myself, so.
Got it. 1 second.
Thank you for calling on me. I was going to say that state workers like the regional center service coordinator or the DOR counselor is required by law to accommodate under the ADA, but they are not trained to support communication because that is typically trained only to people who are master's level professionals in speech and language pathology or trained in social pragmatic language disorders like social workers. So if you make your request in writing, you can make the request in a way that is part of your communication style. Because if you need help to communicate your request, then you are not able to you will need communication support to ask for communication support. So it's best to copy a template and send it so that you know that your request is made by law in a way that they have to cooperate and accommodate. And in fact, the one request that was granted to me was that they utilize these regional center to utilize their in-house support staff to help them figure out how to accommodate my request. So you can ask them to figure it out and not make it your problem. If it's your problem, it's you being disadvantaged by your disability. Thank you.
Thanks, Henny. I love that you brought up templates. I really appreciate that. So DRC loves templates because we know it makes your life a little bit easier. So a lot of the publications that are linked in your handout have template letters you can use to ask for things in different situations so that you don't have to completely start from scratch. And that can be really helpful. There's no one magic way you have to write a request for things, but sometimes it's easier not to have to think, okay, how do I start this? And how do I format it? And how do I, get right to the point? It can be helpful to just plug your information into the template. So thank you for that. All right, I also recommend asking as far ahead of time as you can. And again, there'll be times when that's not doable, but when you can, it gives whoever you're asking for a communication support from time to get their act together and figure out how to do what you're asking so that things go smoothly. There are times when we don't have advance notice, but when you can give people advance notice, it may make their lives easier and make your life easier. And, we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about different places you might ask for communication supports from, but there's usually kind of an element of showing that you really need what you're asking for because of a disability. So sometimes you do that using a doctor's note to go along with your template letter that you've created. And in some situations, figuring out what you need is a little more involved and you need an assessment done by an expert. So we'll come back to those concepts as we move along here. And then I just want to talk a little bit about kind of the challenge of deciding when to sort of stand your ground and say, I need this exact thing versus when to be flexible and sort of willing to negotiate. And I don't think there's like any easy formula for this, but I just think it's something to be thinking about, right? If you're getting into a lot of battles, advocating for your communication supports, you may want to take a step back and ask yourself, are there times where I could maybe engage this other side in a dialogue where I hear what their concerns are and they hear what mine are, and we come to some sort of agreement that works for both of us. So there are situations where what you need is what you need, right? And there are situations where maybe together we can come up with something creative that addresses everybody's concerns. So those are just things to think about as you're approaching asking for communication supports. And as Henny brought up, which I love, anticipating my every slide, get help if you need it, right? So if you need help to put your request in written form and you have somebody in your life who you trust who can help you get it down on paper, You know, it's okay to ask for help. If you get to a point where you feel like you need legal help, that's a great time to call Disability Rights California or another advocate who might be able to give you guidance about your rights and about what you are and aren't entitled to. And then we just want to always remember that no doesn't have to be the end of the conversation, right? In every area we're going to talk about today and next week, you have some kind of right to make a complaint, to make an appeal. The details of how those work is different in different settings. But the theme is, if someone tells you no and you feel strongly that you need what you asked for and that the no is the wrong decision, you have a right to contest that in some way. So just keep that in mind that, you know, and you don't have to fight every decision, right? We all pick our battles in life to some extent, but knowing that you have the right to do that is really important so that when that situation comes up, you know that, that you're not completely out of options. Do we have any questions? I thought I saw another raised hand. Ray, do we have another person we want to call on before we move on?
I don't see. Oh, no.
Looks like
there is one.
Ryan Duncanwood is raising a hand.
Ryan, are you going to type in the chat? I'm not sure, Rick, in answer to Rick's question, but I'm just looking at Ryan here. Ryan's an AAC user, so.
And Ryan, you are unmuted, so whenever you're ready, we're ready for you.
Ryan says yes, he's going to type in the chat.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll go ahead and mute you, but we'll keep an eye out for your comment or question in the chat.
And then we also have a Chris who also raised their hand.
Chris, I've gone ahead and given you the option to unmute. Go ahead and click that.
Hello. My fight for my fellow California, especially my fellow disabled persons, is to get away to become advocates for inclusion, especially for a disabled future. Thank you. That's my advice to everyone.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you for that. Appreciate that encouraging word.
And then we also have one more question in chat. This is
Great.
from Rick, who asked, did an earlier speaker invoke the ADA to obtain services?
So I'm going to defer that question to later. We're going to talk a little bit about situations where the ADA applies. I think it might be easier to address that as we move along here, but we haven't forgotten about you. Maybe late in the day today and early in the day next week. So keep coming back. Thank you for asking that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move along, and then we can always come back to more questions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how
Megan?
you feel. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Ryan wrote, I'm not doing self-determination.
And you don't have to.
Right.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. And we'll talk about that a bit next week when we talk about regional center services. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how you figure out who should give you communication supports. So first of all, I think it's helpful to kind of put requests for communication supports in two big categories. So one is supports that are just for a particular setting. So if there's a communication support I need at school to participate in school, school is probably the one that's going to have to provide it, right? And if there's something I need at work to do my job, it's probably my employer who's going to provide that, right? And if I need a communication support to ask a question of the pharmacist at Walgreens, it's probably Walgreens that's going to provide that support, right? So that's pretty intuitive. Usually those come from the entity that is the place where you need it, right? And then the second category is communication supports that you take with you everywhere. So I think the most obvious example is if you need an expensive AAC device, and it takes a while to figure out what you need and to learn how to use it, and then you need an agency to purchase it, and then once you're all set up, you're going to take that with you everywhere and use it to communicate with everyone. So that's a scenario we'll talk about more on day 2. So today we'll be talking about specific settings where you might need a communication support and how to ask that entity to give you what you need. All right, so we're gonna talk about communication supports in a few different settings today. So first, we're gonna talk about school. And by school here, I mean the public school system that most people call K through 12. And for many people with disabilities, it's preschool through a transition program until age 21. And so we're going to talk about two different sets of folks who get services from their school. So first, we're going to talk about people who qualify for an IEP, who are getting special education. So if you have questions about being eligible for special education, that's outside of the scope of what we're going to focus on today, but it's a great topic for an intake with Disability Rights California. So feel free to fill out that intake form that Ray dropped in the chat. And Ray, it might help to drop it in again as we go along, because I know there's a lot of stuff in the chat. That way people can find it, and it's handy. But we're going to talk about some magic words in the situation where you have an IEP and you need communication supports at school. So there's sort of a little right, the specific right that connects most clearly to communication supports. And then there's the big right, there are the big rights we have in special ed. So the little right is a right to the related services that a student needs to benefit from special education. So related services can be almost anything that school does for you that isn't just plain old instruction. So teacher teaching the lesson, that's not related services. Anything else you need at school really to benefit from that teaching is a related service. So that can be occupational therapy, it can be a one-to-one aid, it can be a piece of equipment you need, it can be a special chair you need to sit in to be comfortable at your desk, it can be all kinds of things, right? And so if you need a communication device, if you need a human to provide communication support, those things would fall into the category of related services. Now, the big rights that every special education student has that are important to always keep in mind when you're advocating for anything in special ed land are the right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And the reason we care about those when we're asking for something really specific is that anytime you can connect your request for something, the communication support, to these other rights, it helps make your case to the school district that they really need to do it, right? If there's something that you need to get an appropriate education, the school district better provide it, or they're really violating the law and getting themselves into a bad situation, right? And if you need a communication support to access the least restrictive environment, they know that that's a pretty fundamental right you have too. And so those are things you may want to bring up when you're asking for a communication support. Paint the big picture for them and talk to them about how this communication support will let you participate in the regular classroom, and it will let you get an appropriate education, and how without those things, those rights will not be a reality for you. All right, so how to ask for communication supports when you have an IEP. So I think probably everybody who's been in special ed or is in special ed now has heard of IEP meetings and had lots of IEP meetings, right? Some of them too long, right? So your IEP meeting is the main place to ask for things, to ask for any kind of change to your IEP. But I think there are times, especially when it comes to, meeting complex needs where it's not really totally obvious to a layperson what ought to happen. There are times where you might want to take a step back and request an assessment first, because the regular members of your IEP team may not know that much, for example, about assistive technology, right? They know it exists, but they don't know what all the choices are for a device that might work for you. They don't know which one you're able to operate successfully, which one, is going to meet your needs the best. And the school district all on its own should be doing assessments when they're needed, right? They are supposed to assess in every area related to a person's suspected disabilities. But we all know that their idea of what assessments they should be doing and our idea might be different. So you don't have to just sit around and wait for them to realize that they should do an assessment. If you think there's a question you need answered, you need information from an expert about to develop an appropriate IEP, you can ask for an assessment. So if you're under 18, it would be your parent who has that right usually. If you're over 18, you may be able to do this yourself, or if you've assigned your educational rights to someone you trust, that person can make that request for an assessment. And then once that assessment is done, an IEP meeting would automatically be held. And now you have this great assessment, hopefully, to talk about at the IEP meeting. So the team has better information to use to decide what communication supports you need. Just like when we ask for related services, we want to connect it to our right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. When we ask for a service, we want to connect it to the goals in the IEP. And I think it's an easy trap that we've all fallen into to kind of gloss over the goals. Yeah, those look good. But what I really want to talk about is this service I want, right? Get down to the bottom line. But the goals really are supposed to drive what services you get, right? And sometimes getting a really good goal in your IEP is easier than getting them to agree, yes, we'll buy you this $10,000 device, right? And so sometimes it's a first step in the advocacy process to get them to write goals that you won't be able to meet without the appropriate communication supports. So if you have an IEP that has no communication goals in it, they're not going to have to provide communication supports for you to meet your goals, and they're going to think they're doing just fine, right? And we know they're not. So if you can get them to write a goal that says, and these are just examples, right? Everybody's what their appropriate goals are would be different, but if you can get them to write a goal that you will, initiate a social interaction with a peer in your art class, how are you going to do that if you can't communicate, right? They'll have to provide a communication support that's appropriate for you to meet that goal. And in the long run, if you end up having a dispute with your school district about whether they're going to provide the communication support, the fact that you're not making progress on that goal is good evidence that there's something they should be doing that they're not, and it may help you in that process. All right, so what if they say no? As we already talked about in every one of these settings, we're going to talk about you have things you can do if they say no. So the hearing process that you can use to resolve a disagreement with your school district about what should go in your IEP is called due process. But kind of like the IEP process and assessment, you may want to back up one step. So we talked about asking for an assessment, and then the school district does their assessment. But what if the assessment they do is garbage? What do we do then, right? If you have a garbage assessment, it's going to lead to a garbage IEP, right? And we don't want to let that happen. So if your school district does an assessment in an area you asked for or an area they decided to do, and they do a bad job and it's wrong, you have a right to ask for something called an independent educational evaluation, which is basically a free second opinion. So when you ask for an IEE, what you're asking the school district to do is to pay for a new assessment, but not do it themselves. You're asking them to pay someone who's not a school district employee and who you agree to, right? You can choose in agreement with them, right? There are some limits to that. Both sides agree is appropriate and qualified. You're asking them to pay that person to do an assessment. And sometimes that helps resolve things in an IEP meeting, right? You bring the IEE and it says, no, actually, this person does need the support. And they say, okay, fine, we'll give it to you. Sometimes the school district is still stubborn and sticks to their guns, but that doesn't mean the IEE didn't accomplish anything, because now you have this great assessment that can be evidence if you have to go to due process. It can help you show the judge that you're right and the school district is wrong. That was a lot of information. I want to give you one more warning about IEEs, and then I'll break for questions because I mentioned there might be some. So get them ready in the chat if you have them. The one thing that sometimes catches people off guard about asking for an IEE is that the school district is not really allowed to try to talk you out of it, or to say, no, or to offer you something else instead, say, oh, let our district person try one more time. Sometimes they do it, but they're not legally allowed to do it. Their only choices when you ask for one are to say yes and fund it, or to file for due process against you. And that having them file for due process against you part is the part that can catch people off guard, right? You were asking for an IEE because you were trying to do something less drastic than going to due process at this point, and that can make people a little bit nervous. So it's just good to know that that's a thing they can do. Some districts do that a lot, some not so much. But that's just a little warning. And if you want to read more about IEEs, there should be a link in your handout to our publication about them. So now I'm going to stop talking for a second and see if we have any questions about getting communication supports from school when you have an IEP.
There are some questions. I'm just going to go through them in order. Going back
Sounds
to
good.
Ryan, who was typing his question, he's asking how he can get regional center to fund him to go camping. It's not communication related. So do you want him to go through the sign up?
Yeah, so Ryan, if you'd like to talk one-on-one with somebody like Ray, who could talk you through that, you're welcome to fill out the intake form that is linked. Or if it's easier for you, you can call us at our 800 number. We will talk some about Regional Center next week, focused on communication supports, not so much focused on camping, but that sounds like a great topic for an intake. We'd love to talk to you about that. Thanks.
Okay, just there are some comments in there about the SLP assessment paid for by the school district will only evaluate how much speech therapy is needed to meet educational goals. So if you need long-term evidence of medical necessity for communication support, think beyond the IEP.
I love it. A great preview of coming attractions. Yes, and we will definitely talk about kind of how those special ed assessments play out in later in life when you're trying to get things from other sources. We will talk about
I
that.
think, can I add in here, Megan, a little bit?
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's important to remember that a speech therapist or the speech pathologist in the schools is to look at communication as well. So remember that they tend to call us speech people, but we actually do communication. Like I only do this much speech time in my life. But it's the same person. So a person with a speech and language credential or certification should also be looking at your communication, education from the school system. So we get kind of misnamed sometimes.
Well, and that brings us back to a good point, right? I think a lot of times people feel a lot of pressure when they're making a written request to the school district for an assessment to know what it should be called, right? What tests should I tell them to do? You don't have to know that, right? Your job is to know what question you want answered and what area of need you want addressed. You should be able to make a request in plain language that says, I've noticed that my child has challenges in these areas. I would like those areas assessed. And then they should come up with an assessment plan where they figure out who the right expert is to assess each of those things. And then when they send you that assessment plan, you can look at it and figure out whether you think it seems adequate, right? You go, oh, I think you're skipping some of the stuff I asked for here. And at that point, if you're not sure, like, oh, what's missing here, you might want to ask somebody who can give you some guidance or some advice. But when you make that initial request, it's okay to just say in regular words what your concerns are. Because really, an assessment request is saying, there's a question we need answered and here's what it is, right? You don't have to say, oh, I know exactly what assessment tools they should use and use this IQ test and use this. You don't have to know that, right? That's not your job. Your job is to know yourself or to know your child, your loved one who you're advocating for, and what you see as the needs. So,
and that reminds me too, that the number one thing that would happen when I was taking assistive technology / AAC assessments, that's how the paperwork would come in, because it goes under the same category, is that the school district didn't understand what you guys as families were really asking for. So what you just said is hugely important. Really focus on what do you want to accomplish. If you want to accomplish whether or not the person can access their curriculum, that's assistive technology. But that's very different than a whole different assessment than if you want to find out how your individual or you as an individual are going to communicate to access your education. So that's an AAC assessment. So that is like 3 stars on that one, hugely important because always written down wrong.
Yeah. And, you know, we don't want you to be too freaked out that like, oh no, I'm going to say it wrong in my request.
No.
So use regular words and tell them what you want. But then if you feel like there was a miscommunication when you get the assessment plan back, this is another chance to engage in a discussion about what should be included. You don't have to just sign it. You can say, oh, I have a question. I think there's something missing here. Maybe it wasn't clear in my request that I wanted this addressed, and see if they'll add it, right? So if they'll add whatever the thing is that's missing. So
There is
Sorry.
one person with their hand raised. Evelyn.
all right, are you able to unmute?
Sí,
Evelyn?
buenas tardes. ¿Me escuchan? ¿Me pueden traducir, por favor?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hang on, I'm getting her back.
She may be
Evelyn,
on the Spanish channel.
Gracias.
No, she was muted. Go
La
ahead,
primera
Evelyn.
pregunta
Oh, there
es,
we go.
dijiste que podemos pedir una evaluación independiente, pero ¿qué pasa cuando los distritos escolares defienden su evaluación? ¿Cuál es el siguiente paso? ¿Qué pruebas que puede tener el padre para ganar esa evaluación independiente? Y la segunda es, cuando el distrito acepta la evaluación independiente, a veces ellos ponen un máximo de costo que debe costar esta evaluación independiente, pero tengo entendido que la ley no habla de un costo, habla de requisitos de certificados del evaluador. ¿Podrías explicar un poquito de estas dos cosas, por favor? Gracias.
Sure. So the first question, I believe, was what happens if the school district does say no to the IEE and take you to due process? So if the district files, this is one of those points where you decide whether you're going to fight that battle, because it's hard work going to due process to prove that they should fund the IEE. And I would recommend consulting with a special education attorney about your particular situation at that stage, because the details of your situation are going to be important in deciding how you want to proceed. It's probably more expensive for the school district to go to due process against you than to fund the IEE. So usually if they're standing their ground about that, it's, you know, they have some agenda other than just wanting to not pay for this IEE, because due process is going to cost them money too. It may be that they feel like we're getting way too many IEE requests and we want to put our foot down and make an example of you. But those would all be good things to discuss with an attorney in a, you know, an individual consultation. And then I'm sorry, I'm blanking on part 2 of the question.
So what if they say, oh, we only are going to give this much money towards the IE? Do they have that right?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, almost every school district is going to place some parameters or try to place some parameters on who can do an IEE or how much it can cost. In fact, a lot of them will give you a list and say, choose someone from this list. So if they do that, I would recommend exploring the people on the list. And if there's somebody on the list who you feel good about too, that's your easiest solution, is because you know they'll agree to it. But if you have concerns about the people on the list, you can look for someone outside of the list and take that to the school district and say, would you approve this person? When it comes to cost, obviously school districts are always trying to control costs. That's what's behind all of this, right? To all the fights we have with school districts. Sometimes those caps are pretty reasonable. They're, you know, what we would expect the type of evaluation to cost, and sometimes they're absurd, right? So I think how you would try to deal with that would depend. And I think sometimes it's having different views about what kind of assessment is needed. I see this come up in situations where a person has really unique and complicated needs. So the school district thinks, you know, any old speech pathologist will do. And the parent thinks, no, I need this person with certain expertise that not every speech and language pathologist has, and therefore I need this one person who charges twice as much. So again, those are, you know, kind of unique individual situations. I don't think we can say that it's never going to work for a school district to try to cap the cost, but I also think if you're trying to work with the school district to come to an agreement about who can do an IEE, and they're placing a cap on cost that basically seems like they're trying to prevent you from getting an IEE, or they're trying to make your life hard, that's a good time, again, to consult an attorney or to call Disability Rights California and see if we can give you some specific advice about that situation. You could, I think what legally you could do is treat it as a denial and file for due process against them, but most people aren't going to want to do that because that's hard work, right? So most people are going to want to try to find some way to reason with them and avoid that outcome. So.
Okay, there's a few more questions in the chat and one person raising their hand, so I'll keep going in order.
Okay.
First question is, how do you request for an IEE? And then there's the next question is in Spanish, if one of the interpreters could turn it into English. We
Okay,
can follow that later.
let me answer the first one first before I forget. So if you click on the link in the handout for our publication about IEEs, I believe there's even a template letter in there you can use to ask for an IEE to make it easy. Okay, so it sounds like, if I'm understanding right, it's a situation where when it's the school district's turn to do their own assessment, they don't have anyone qualified, and they may be even admitting that. So in those situations, this comes up a lot with either really specialized assessments or really small school districts that just have a small staff. They can contract with an outside agency to do an assessment that they don't have anybody in-house to do. And that's probably what they should have done. But if they instead do a crappy assessment or just ignore your request for an assessment, you could request an IEE as a response to that. You could treat their failure to do an assessment within the timeline as them doing a terrible assessment and ask for an IEE and then see if they approve that. It wasn't clear to me if maybe there was a question about if you did ask for an IEE, but the district didn't come up with someone appropriate to do it.
Or I was wondering also, are you saying that they're doing evaluations without an interpreter available to you to participate? That could be.
Oh, gotcha.
So maybe Lillian, if you can clarify that. Oh, sorry, Lillian.
Care of it. 1 second.
Hola, buenas tardes. Sí, mi pregunta es, En el caso, tal vez es particular, pero puede pasarle a otras personas. Mi hija es autismo no verbal, pero ella de alguna manera natural adquirió el usar el sign language. Actualmente utiliza 30 signos para poderse comunicar. Siempre he tratado de que el distrito pudiera tomar esa herramienta que tiene ella para comunicarse, pero el distrito no ha querido tomarlo en cuenta y lo evade. Actualmente me di cuenta que no tienen un evaluador de sign language. Entonces solicité una evaluación independiente y pues también ellos evaden y dicen que no hay. Y era por eso mi pregunta, ¿qué hacer en este caso?
Okay, thank you for clarifying. So when you ask for an IEE, the district either needs to say yes, we'll fund it, or no, and we're filing for due process against you because we think the assessment we already did is fine. They can't just say, gee, we don't know who would do an IEE, right? That's not actually their problem at that stage, right? When they say yes, they're saying, yes, we'll pay for it. And then the ball is sort of back in your court as the parent to identify who you want to do it, which is work, but it's also giving you some power to go find somebody who you think will do a good job and say, hey, district, can we fund this person since you can't seem to find anybody? And so I think that's what you would want to push back and say, are you saying no? And if so, where's the due process filing? Or are you saying yes? And then so that I can start looking for an appropriate evaluator to bring to you.
Okay, we have Rick who has his hand up for a while.
Great.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to circle back to Darlene. Darlene, I'm the coach, mentor, and advocate for a high-functioning autistic for the last 8 years. He's actually in the regional center system, but I think this is for both systems, even in the school, the IEP. What we're finding is that due to his expressive and receptive language deficits, we're finding that his the assessments he's being given by the service providers, to be quite honest with you, I think some of them are hallucinating. I've been on the calls when they've done some of the assessments, and I'll read the assessments and I'll go, where did they get that from? Where? And so and it's mostly because when they focus on it's not what he says, it's what he makes it mean to him. But my question from a general standpoint is if an individual in the regional center or in the school under an IPP or an IPP, if you disagree with that, what are with the assessment from the service provider or the school, what would you recommend in terms of the conversations? I mean, at the rate I'm going, I could be spending all of my time because about every assessment, I don't know what they're on, but he'll say something and I'm like, where in the heck did they get that? It's like they've extrapolated from themselves, and these are either therapists or so whatever. I'm like, where did they get that? So what is your suggestion, whether one's in the IEP or IPPB, what would someone do, if they disagreed with parts of that assessment?
With the assessment. Yeah, so in the school setting, it's more clear than regional center, and we'll talk about regional center next week. But in the school setting, the IEE is that legal tool that's available to you. Now, if you're finding yourself requesting IEEs over and over and over again, it's just a sign that strategy may not be working. That's what I always say to people about having, an IEP meeting every month. If you're having to do that, maybe it's time for a different strategy. But that's the tool that's available to push back if you think that they did a bad assessment in the school setting. But yeah, we'll talk about regional center next week. So we'll kind of defer that part of your question. But if I fail to answer it next week, be sure to bring it up again.
Sure, thank you. I'd also like to, if we could answer, what was the young man earlier that wanted to go to summer camp. If we could I know you gave him a reference, but I'd like to see something like that? I'd like to, if we could just,
Mhm.
I'd like to see how you answer that. Thank you.
So again, this series is going to focus on communication supports, but
Mhm.
if somebody wants to talk about accessing other services, we're always happy to do an intake, which is probably the best way to get that addressed. And if any of you are with organizations that would like to have DRC come to a totally different training on a different topic that, maybe this has sparked some ideas, we're always happy to do that. Raymond does lots and lots of trainings on lots of topics, and a lot of our advocates do that as well. So you could use the intake form if what you're really asking for is another training on another topic, to let us know what you're interested in, and we can follow up with you. So, all right, so I think I'm gonna move on now, and then if at the very end we still have some lingering questions in this area, we can always come back to them. I want to make sure we at least talk about 504 plans today. So this may not apply to as many folks on this call, so I'll move through it fairly quickly. But if you don't have an IEP, but do have a 504 plan with your school district and you need communication supports, the magic words about what the school district is obligated to do is that they have to meet the individual needs of students with disabilities as adequately as the needs of students without disabilities. And when you see people with disabilities being compared to people without disabilities, that's a sign that we're now in a disability discrimination framework for what your rights are. It's really about equal access. And 504 plans are the way that school districts provide accommodations that students need to have equal access. So if you need a communication support for equal access, kind of like in IEP land, you ask for an assessment. And I say kind of like, not exactly like, because these processes are kind of parallel, but special education law provides a lot more specific rules and timelines that protect you to some extent. It's a little more loosey-goosey in 504 land, which is part of the reason that if somebody's needing a lot of supports and their needs are pretty complex and they only have a 504 plan, to me, that's a red flag that they maybe should have an IEP. And so if anybody's in that situation where you only have a 504 plan, but you think maybe you ought to be able to get an IEP, that would be a great topic for an intake with DRC, and you can fill out the form or give us a call and we can get into that, dive into that with you. But assuming you have a 504 plan and that's appropriate for you, you can ask for assessments. And you can you hold IEP or 504 meetings to talk about what needs to go in your 504 plan to allow you equal access. So what if they say no or they say yes, but then don't follow through on it? So kind of like in special ed land, there is a hearing process and a written complaint process. The difference I would flag for you is that 504 hearings are not great. The way they work is that the school district hires somebody to come be the hearing officer or the judge to hear the hearing. They're supposed to be impartial. The law does say that, but it's somebody they're hiring. It's not a district employee. It's basically like a contractor they bring in to do this one thing, right? You can imagine if you're somebody who a school district hires to be a 504 hearing officer, you'd kind of like to be the person they call next time, right? So the district does exert some influence in that way, right? The person who's serving as the hearing officer kind of wants to please the school district. So even if they're trying to be objective, we worry about how objective they really are. And then the Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, complaint process is really meant for sort of straightforward compliance issues where a judge wouldn't need to hear evidence. So things like they refuse to have a 504 meeting with me, or I have a 504 plan already and they're just not implementing it. Some issues can kind of be, some issues are clearly one or the other, right? And some can be kind of be framed as either one. Because we know that the 504 hearing process tends to not be awesome, we tell people if there's any way to frame it as an issue that ought to be dealt with through OCR, we would nudge you in that direction. We would encourage you to lean that way since that's a little bit better process. But again, if you're that deeply embroiled in a battle with your school district over communication supports for a 504 plan, we'd also love to talk to you about IEPs and whether you might qualify, even if they've said no in the past. So any questions just specific to the 504 plan piece before we move on?
I don't see anything just on the 504 plan.
Okay. Great. All right. So let's talk about college while we're in school mode, because I think that's helpful. And then we might push the rest to next week just to not be rushed. So college, kind of like 504 land, is a place where we're in an equal access disability discrimination framework for what your legal protections are. So colleges have to provide reasonable accommodations that you need to have equal access, and that includes communication supports you need. So usually the way you ask for that in college is that there's some kind of office that deals with this, right? It's called different things at different schools. Might be called disability services, disabled student services, something along those lines. So that's usually where you ask if you're going to any community college, a big state school, a good sized private school. If you're going to or applying to a little tiny private school, it's possible that they don't have a whole office devoted to this, but they still probably have a person whose responsibility it is to handle reasonable accommodation requests. They might call that person a 504 officer or an ADA coordinator, something like that. And if you're not sure, you can always, again, we always default to using regular language, right? You can call up your school's main phone number and say, can you transfer me to the person who handles reasonable accommodation requests for students with disabilities? Because it may be somebody who it's not their whole job because it's such a tiny school. They also wear some other hat and that's their job title. So you never would have guessed. But you want to make sure you get to the right person or office. So what if they say no? So most schools will have some kind of internal grievance process, and you don't have to use it if you feel like you've already talked to everybody, tried to reason with everybody at the school who you possibly could, and so you know what their answer is going to be. You can skip this step. But if you've only talked to, a sort of first level person and you think you might be able to convince someone to see reason, sometimes it's helpful to go through that grievance process to try to get things resolved at the lowest possible level. You also have a right to file discrimination complaints. And you have different options for where to file and different deadlines depending on what kind of school it is. So mostly I want you to come away today knowing there are deadlines, and if this comes up, I should look it up because none of us are going to remember, right, by the time this comes up. But if you click on the link that's in the handout, you can get to our publication about higher education, and it talks more about the details of these complaints and what your deadline would be. Usually you want to file right away anyway because you want to get the problem resolved, right? But you definitely don't want to wait too long, miss the deadline, and then not be allowed to file it. All right, any questions about that, about college?
I don't see any questions just on college.
Okay, and
I don't see anyone raising their hand either.
okay, so I think maybe just in the interest of not rushing, we'll save DOR and work for next time. So something to look forward to next week. We can go back to any special ed questions that we didn't get to, or if folks have just, a question that just popped into your head from earlier in the presentation, feel free to type that in the chat.
Okay, let me go back. There was one that hasn't been addressed. 1 second.
Thanks, Raymond. I very much appreciate Raymond's hard work in monitoring the chat today.
I'll keep scrolling, but there was a lot of discussion in the chat about IEE and if the school has the power to basically select what provider, I believe it was.
Yeah, so the school shouldn't be dictating a provider for an IEE. And if they try to do that, you can push back and say, oh, I'd rather have this person, right? It's an opportunity to negotiate because the whole point is for it to be somebody who you feel is going to do a better job than their person, right? They already got their shot to choose somebody and they didn't do such a great job, right? So, we also see people with the opposite problem, right? The school district says, okay, we'll fund it. Good luck finding someone. And the parent maybe feels kind of overwhelmed trying to figure out how to choose someone. But I think all in all, that's a better position to be in, because you really, if you're to the point of filing requesting an IEE, you really want to have some control over who does it. And it's work to do the legwork to find somebody, but it also is your opportunity to find the right person who really gets it and is going to do a good job, hopefully.
And then here's a question. Can we request the SOE hours of my son that will expire on August 2021 be transferred to do a speech and language assessment, since we have used medical already?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question.
Let's see if the person is here. You can raise your hand, and if you like, you can unmute and ask your question and clarify.
Yeah, that might be a good idea.
That would be LG Stylo 6. Here. I don't think that person might be gone now.
I see them in the participation list.
Okay.
Button for them to unmute. I'm not sure if they have received my invitation.
So LG, unmute.
They may not be at their device right now.
Okay.
Okay,
Another one
we
just
can
came
always
in.
come back. Yeah,
Another Spanish one just came in.
great.
And I don't know who's translating, but can the translator read this last one from Liliana?
Yeah, so it sounds like you're talking about a situation where you get an IEE done and it's great and you agree with it, but the school district still says, well, we're sticking by our original decision. We don't care what the IEE says, if I'm reading that, understanding that right. So in that situation, obviously that's frustrating, right? But it still doesn't mean that the IEE was for nothing. You now at least have that assessment in case you decide to go to due process, because otherwise you'd have to hire an expert to testify at a due process hearing, and that's really expensive. So having an assessment that says what you were hoping it would say, and you got it for free, is a decent part of the battle of going to due process. And if you're trying to decide whether to go to due process over that decision, it's a good time to consult with a special ed attorney and see what their thoughts are about the strength of your case and whether it's worth going forward to fight that decision. But for sure, it's frustrating. Like, why why fund an assessment and then ignore it, right? It's definitely frustrating when that happens.
We have a raised hand from Vidal Medina.
Hello.
Vidal, can you make sure that you've chosen the English channel, please?
Well, let me see.
There we go. Now we hear you.
We can hear
Can you
you.
hear me? Okay, great. So my name is Vidal. I'm assistant change advocate for an ILC here in California. And our agency did a few IEPs, but one of the things that we found very beneficial is a lot of what you're talking about today. Well, if there was a way that parents and their student could get this information together, and that's kind of what we do. We sometimes we're with them, sometimes we're not. It really depends on the school district, and we know all the districts here that we work with or work around. But sometimes parents and students can be the best advocates for the best outcome possible. Now, I say that with this caveat that sometimes I think that the districts are so difficult, you almost need an attorney with you when you go to these IEPs, no matter how good of an advocate the parent is or the student is. But I think it does help when they are, when they have information like this, it really clarifies for them what they thought the process was going to include and what it's not. Because you got to remember, a lot of IEPs that I have been with parents, there's at least 6 or 7 faculty members. And then it's the parent and their child. And that situation can kind of just derail any kind of plan.
You can feel really ganged up on.
You may have. Absolutely.
Sure.
Thank you very much to allow me to make the comment.
Of course. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. And, you know, I said this more back when I was a client's rights advocate, but there are times when we do get involved because the school district, you know, the parent or the client is doing everything right. Like they're taking all the right steps, they're following all the advice we're giving them, and the district is still just ignoring them. And there are times where we jump in and make a phone call or something where I feel like this feels less like practicing law and more like babysitting, right? Like we're telling them to do what they already know they should do, right? And that's really frustrating and can make you feel really powerless. So I really feel for folks who are struggling with the IEP process with a difficult school district. It's really hard. That said, sometimes a little bit of advice and strategizing can help you go into them feeling a little more empowered. So knowing what some of the little tools and tricks are that you can use to push back and stand your ground can be helpful. We have some handy publications, including one that's just like basic tips about how to advocate with the school district. And some of those things can be helpful in those situations. We're also always happy to talk with somebody. You know, you have an IEP meeting coming up. The last one was awful, and you just want to go into this one feeling like you have a plan and feeling prepared. We're always happy to consult with somebody and talk them through it and kind of help them figure out some strategies that may help. And then the long-term payoff of that is that each time you feel a little more empowered and it feels a little less daunting. So, but I know it can be really hard.
Excuse me, sorry, real quick before we finish up here, Delphina has asked a question in Spanish, and so I wanted to, while we have this whole experience going on here, make sure she gets to answer that real quick. So
yeah, and I'll just say real quick before we do that, I'm happy. Of course, I know there's some folks who probably need to go. It's dinner time. I'm so glad you all came, and I look forward to seeing you in a week. I'm happy to stay on a little bit so that we can clear out the last few questions. Okay. So if people want to stay to have their question answered or to listen to the answer to somebody else's question, feel free to stay. If you're ready to take off, feel free to do that too. And thanks so much for coming.
Thanks,
all right,
Megan.
So hit me with it.
Okay, so whoever's translating, can you translate that chunk that Delphina Acosta asked at 5:23?
Ed already answered it in the chat.
Oh, did she?
Well, I didn't answer it fulsomely. I mentioned that we will be talking about college next week because Delphina is asking about what happens when DSPS, when a professor says, I'm not going to accommodate you, and DSPS says, well, they're not obligated to. Yeah.
Great. So let me go back to the college slide. We can talk about that now. So first of all, I want to acknowledge that is another really frustrating situation, right? If DSPS has said yes, then like that should be the college's answer, right? But we see these situations a lot where individual professors think they can do what they want and don't really get it. I say this as someone whose mother is a part-time community college professor who doesn't always get it. So they're real people who make mistakes, right? So I think as a first step, it's worth going back to DSPS and telling them the experience you're having and saying, you know, I really appreciate you setting up these communication supports for me, but if the professor's not doing it, the school is still engaging in disability discrimination. I would hate to have to file a grievance or a complaint. So you're like being reasonable with them, but you're making a polite threat to escalate this and see if they'll get it sorted out. I get the sense that at a lot of colleges, DSPS feels like they don't have a lot of power, right? They have the expertise to say, oh, these are accommodations that might help in this situation, but they don't feel like they don't seem to be empowered to tell a professor what to do. But somebody needs to be, right? And so hopefully there's somebody up the chain who understands their legal obligations, and hopefully that can get resolved with an internal grievance. but it might be a good point to either politely threaten one or go ahead and file one and see if you can get this straightened out and get somebody, a dean or whoever up the chain decides about those grievances, to tell the professor what to do, somebody who does have that power. So, but it's definitely frustrating, and I feel for you if you're experiencing that.
Darlene, is your hand raised? It looked like
Oh,
it.
no, I didn't take it down. I didn't take it down. Sorry.
It just like blends into your little DVU logo
know.
there. I didn't even notice.
Oh yeah, mine said Darlene Hansen hand raised. That's why I can see.
Ah, gotcha. All right.
think
Any
that
other
might be
lingering
it.
questions?
Anybody? We got some thank yous. Oh, here, wait.
We have a question from
Um,
Peter Ashley.
yeah, Peter Ashley, this is Peter's mom. So it's Peter's mom.
Hi, Peter and Peter's mom.
He had a seizure earlier, so I'm sitting in for him. Question, in the past, when I have asked the community college disability office for info, they want him to advocate. Does he have to, if he is conserved? Oh yeah, that's a big problem. Is that next week's edition?
No, we can talk about that
Okay.
now. So
That's a biggie.
I mean, the legal answer is the conservatorship has whatever powers in it that it has, and people need to honor it, right? I think the practical real life answer is that it's helpful to think about kind of where colleges are coming from. You know, colleges are tasked with dealing with people when they're first launched into adult life. And even with people without disabilities, there are a lot of parents kind of trying to help, right? But maybe be more involved than the college thinks is appropriate, given that someone is a young adult. So I think it's really helpful to acknowledge, you know, I know he's an adult and I'm really glad you want to hear from him because I want his voice to be heard too. I think that's a good way to start that conversation. And I think it's good to include him as much as you can, right? If he's able to participate in the discussion, maybe he needs you there for additional support. That helps to show them you're not trying to like override him, right? Or there's no funny business going on here, that you're just there to support, and that to the extent that his disability makes it hard for him to do this all on his own, you're helping out. I think a lot of times kind of acknowledging their position and visibly including him as much as you can breaks down some of that resistance to him having, you know, a parent involved in advocating.
Well, I need to say that we have to end because our translators have to end.
Yes, thank you so much to our interpreters today.
Yes, definitely. And I love all the participation. So I can't wait till next week. So I hope you all return. And again, you can rewatch the recording and use the handouts to keep empowering yourself. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank
you. Have a great evening.
And Ed and everyone else.